Hello and welcome to Series 8, Episode 3 of In Suspense, a podcast and vodcast for fans and writers of crime fiction. I'm Leslie Cara and my co-host today is Lauren North. Hello, Lauren.
Hello, Leslie. It's so nice to be back with you. It's working out so well with Nikki. I absolutely love having the alternating weeks. It's so good for our schedule. But I was so jealous last time when you interviewed Louise Candlish. That was so exciting.
It was a fabulous interview.
Oh, it was, I've listened to it twice actually. And so for those who haven't listened, it was Leslie and Nikki interviewing Louise Candlish about her new book, The Only Suspect. And the topic was the Midas touch, books to TV and resilience. And she just had so much to say about how you get to a level of success that she's at and how it isn't overnight. And I think it was really reassuring for a lot of listeners, myself included, actually. We're all going to get there, I think so.
Yeah, it was. She was inspirational, as I guess she would be, because I've heard her speak before, obviously in different interviews. One she did in Harrogate actually with Claire McIntosh, and
yes, I listened to that.
Yeah, you were there too, weren't you? She's absolutely fabulous. But you were saying you were jealous you didn't do the episode. I was jealous I didn't do the episode of Joe Callahan with you and Nikki.
Oh, yeah.
I love that one as well.
It's so nice to listen to them though, isn't it, when you're not involved in them? So
it really is. It really is, yeah. But today we have not one, but two fabulous guests on, and our topic is standalones to series. So obviously that, we know we're going to be talking about writing a series, and the two writers that we've got coming on are at the top of their game, and they are Fiona Cummins and Tim Weaver.
Yes, but before we interview Fiona and Tim, can I say happy publication day, Leslie? The apartment upstairs came out in paperback last week. I saw a fab photo of you in the supermarket, and then over the weekend I saw one of your little grandson and W.H. Smith's, I think, and he was gorgeous. So tell us, how was your publication day and how's your eyes?
Oh, well, I'll do the book first. Yeah, no, it was great. I mean, I had planned to go into town to have a lovely lunch with my publishing team and my agent and everything, but because of my eye, I mean, I could have gone actually now, but when we were sort of planning it, I thought it might be too much, and it probably would have been, because it's sort of on and off of trains with my dodgy eyes. So I thought I'd give that a miss. So I had a quiet day. We just had a trip to the supermarket. We only managed to get to Tesco because there aren't many big Asda's and Sainsbury's around where we are. So that was lovely. And Rashid and I celebrated on our own, obviously opened a bottle of something rather nice. And I just spent most of the day, like you do, on social media, and I'm blown away by all the lovely comments. And it was a very nice, quiet publication day. And eyes, as for the eyes, the surgery went well, as you know, and this one is the one that was done, the left one. It's much better now. It's really healing well. And I'm still putting eye drops in, but I've got to go through it all again from next week, because on next Monday, I have got the second one being done. So I'll be back with the old patch on.
Oh, but in a couple of months' time, it'll all be done. The summer will be here, and you'll have had them done, and that'll be it.
Yeah. I've got all that to look forward to, and hopefully it will be better the second time around, because the eyes will be balanced then. I won't have to wear a contact lens in one eye. So hopefully it will all be good, and our listeners will be relieved that they won't have to hear me rabbiting on about my bloody eyes.
Oh no, I think we all go through difficult times, don't we, and health issues, and I think you just realise how fragile we are.
Yes,
like as human beings, like it only takes one little thing, and it affects. There's such a ripple effect. Like our whole lives are affected if our health isn't there. We are.
That's right. And it's made me so. It made me so appreciate my sight, and how difficult it is to do the sort of work that we do as readers and writers. And hats off to people who have sort of sight problems. And it's made me realise I need to start doing the alt text on anything I do on social media. I must admit I haven't been doing that. I know Claire McIntosh is brilliant at doing that, and lots of other authors do it. I really need to do that, because it's just made me realise how difficult it is. And I discovered something last night actually that I didn't even know existed. You can make the font on Twitter bigger, because even on your
Really?
phone. Yeah, I didn't realise you go into settings, so that's helped a bit because
Oh yeah, that's really good.
although their surgery worked, at the moment my close vision is a little bit it's ghosting, you know, so that's helped. So anyway,
Can I
moving
ask,
on.
how are you finding Twitter at the moment? Because I'm sure lots of our listeners are in the same boat. I'm struggling with, like, I feel like I'm not seeing the same amount of fabulous people I was seeing as I used to.
It's very interesting, but it seems to be, for some people it's working exactly the same, and for others, like you say, they're having problems. I haven't really noticed any difference. I usually do the for you rather than the following.
Yeah, I do as well.
And I am seeing most of the things I used to see. There are probably one or two things I'm not seeing, but I don't know if that's because I'm not looking on it as much, because I've been trying to sort of ration my social media, or whether it's if we don't engage with other people's accounts, because I notice that the ones I see a lot of are people that I regularly engage with.
Yes, that's true, actually. I need to engage with lots more people, don't I? Okay, that's good to know.
So I think so, even if it's just liking their posts and things, which I tend to do anyway, but I guess that might be something to do with it. But to be honest, I think the algorithm's all over the place on there at the moment. I don't know what's going on. I really don't. Now, what are you going to tell us what you're up to? You've been doing some edits and things, haven't you?
Yes. So for the first part of this year, I haven't stopped at all. I have just been relentlessly rewriting my LC North book. I got some private edits back and I was rewriting them. And that went to Trans World. And then I made a little mistake in my diary. And I thought I had until the end of February to rewrite my old book that's going to book tour. And I didn't have until the 6th of February. So it was a couple of weeks of, like, I finished one book on the Monday morning. I started working on the next book on the Monday afternoon. It was just flat out, and it's been flat out all weekends. I've not stopped. But I've done it now. I did it, got it in on Friday, and I spent all weekend just sorting out my study. I mean, you can't tell because I was always hiding all the mess anyway, like down below where you can't see, but I had spent 3 hours giving myself a big clear out, and I'm just having a really calm and lovely week now, just reading books and plotting and things. So it was a crazy year. I mean, I still loved it, but it was intense, I think.
So I've got my edits back now for my next novel as well, so I've just printed out the draft and starting that process. So, but actually, you know, I used to sort of dread getting the edits back, but this time, because I struggled so much writing that first draft, I'm really loving doing the edits because I just feel that it's all coming together now. So yeah, it's good. But I think you've got another announcement to make, haven't you, Lauren? You're doing something rather exciting at Colchester.
Yes,
tell our listeners about that.
I will. In Colchester Waterstones, for anyone who's local, I am doing a slightly different event because I was thinking about what kind of event I'd like to go to. And I've always wanted to join a book club, but I never have time to read the books. I don't always necessarily want the books in the book club. But I thought it'd be really great to get a load of book lovers together and just chat about the books that they all love. So everyone is going to come and they're going to bring their favourite book, and they're going to talk about why that's their favourite book. And then we'll talk about, like, what books have made us gasp and what genres we love and what things we don't like, what characters we love to hate, and just have a really lovely chat about books. I think we're going to get a lot of recommendations and stuff. So I just thought, rather than do me talking about my writing process again, sort of thing.
It's such a good idea. It's such a good idea because, you know, as you say, they're sort of in conversation format. Yes, it does work, but you know, it can get a little tired, I think, sometimes.
Well, I think that you can be a book lover and love books and want to talk about books without necessarily caring two hoots how the book was written and what the author does in their morning routine. You know,
yeah,
so
absolutely.
Hopefully
it will attract another type of audience member.
Yeah, so I'm hoping
broaden it out.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope to broaden it out. And I think, you know, it's great for book clubs, and it's also great for people who I'm not in a book club. It's great for those sort of people, so you can come with a friend or you can come on your own. We're all just going to sit in a big circle. It's going to be very inclusive. There's going to be some nibbles and some drinks. There's a goodie bag. I think my daughter's going to come and play little hostess. So
so I'm like the sound of a goodie bag.
Yes, me too. So yeah, I'm hoping it's going to be good. So yeah, if you're local, please buy a ticket and come.
Brilliant. Yes, well, definitely. You tweeted about it, I think, this morning, didn't you? So
Yes, I need to get on that and do a few more bits on
yeah,
social media, really.
brilliant.
But yeah, shall we go back to talking about our topic?
Oh yes, topic, which will have to be quick, Lauren, because neither of us have ever written a series, so I'm not sure we'll have much to say.
That's so true. Although I came very close once. My Dr. Jenna Lawson from my book 2, who was an A&E doctor, I had planned another book for her actually. But the book that I first wrote was the one that got rejected. And then the second one, which I rewrote with Dr. Jenna Lawson in it, she was just too battered by the end of it to go into another book. But I had in my head, I thought an A&E doctor would see lots of different crimes and lots of things. I thought that'd be quite a good person for a series, but it never quite took off. And now I'm too scared to try again. What about you, Lizzie? Have you been tempted?
I am tempted. It's quite difficult, isn't it, to come up with good ideas for series if one doesn't want to write a police procedural, and that's not something, I mean, I love reading them, absolutely love reading them, but I don't want to necessarily write one myself. But I mean, I have toyed with the idea of writing cozy, and it's not just because of the Richard Osman effect. In fact, it's not because
actually you were talking about writing a cozy way before he even got in on it.
Yes, so I would like to do that. It's finding the time, isn't it? But it might be nice to have that as a little side project while I'm doing something else, because even if nothing comes of it, I'll amuse myself writing.
Yeah, just 100 words a day, little side hustle. That's the way to build it up, I think, isn't it? Not that I have ever managed to do that myself. But.
Do you have a favourite series, Lauren?
I was thinking about that. I absolutely loved about 10 years ago the Jack Reacher books. I was mad for them. So Lee Child's Jack Reacher series. But I've gone off them a bit. And I don't really think I do have a series, but I just finished reading Fiona Cummins' Into the Dark over the weekend, and the main character in that is so brilliant. It's such an interesting detective, so different, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Fiona about it, because I think that's probably now my favourite series.
Oh, brilliant. Yes, so you're right at the start of that, so you can follow them through. Yeah.
What about you?
Well, quite a few series. I mean, I really enjoy the Mark Griffin Holly Wakefield series. She's a criminal psychologist. I don't know if you've read any of Mark's books. We did talk about getting him on the show, didn't we? So we might have to think about that. But I think he's written 4 of them now, and I love them, absolutely love them. I also like Susan Hill's Simon Soraya book set in a fictional cathedral town, Lafferton.
Oh, there's obviously Anne Cleeves, isn't there?
Anne Cleeves, that's the one. That's the one.
I thought you were going to say that.
Thank you so much. Yes, I love the Shetland series by Anne Cleeves.
Yeah.
I mean, I love all her books, and I particularly like also her newest series, The Two Rivers, with Ben, the detective Matthew Venn. So yeah, I love a series, and I like series that you don't have to have necessarily read them in order. So I think we better get Tim and Fiona on to give us some advice, seeing as we're pretty hopeless on the subject.
Oh yeah, yes, we've got lots of questions, haven't we? Right, well, welcome Tim and Fiona to In Suspense. So hello, Fiona and Tim, and welcome to In Suspense.
Good morning.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know you guys are really busy, and we so appreciate it. And before we dive in, we'd love you to introduce yourselves. And we normally read the bios for our guests, but since we've got 2 of you and you're both very chatty and lovely, we thought we would get you to kick off for us. So Fiona, could you introduce yourself, please, to our listeners?
Oh, okay. I'm Fiona. I've written 5 books, with my 6th coming out in the summer. I used to be a journalist before I became a crime writer, but in all honesty, nothing would compel me to go back to that world, because I want to carry on being a writer forever. So I hope that that's allowed, and that's the case. But yeah, no. And yeah, that pretty much sums me up, really. I live in Essex with my family. I have 2 dogs, and I'm currently in my writing shed as we speak.
Yes, I'm hoping it's warm. Look,
it's quite chilly. It's like 1 degree this morning, but I ran up and put the heater on earlier to take the chill off. So it's fine, thanks.
Yes. Oh, brilliant. Well, and your fifth novel, Into the Dark, is already out in hardback, and it's coming out. It came out in paperback last week, didn't it?
That's right, yeah.
And it was described by Sarah Vaughan as complex, inventive, twisty, and unsettling. So a fantastic start to a series, which we're going to.
Oh yeah, I just realised I forgot to mention the name of my book that's currently out. So full
Don't worry,
marks
I
for
have
me.
made notes to things to make sure you said, or I'll say them. So Tim, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm Tim. I write books like everyone else here, and I've written 14 books, 13 of which have been about my series character David Raker, who's a missing persons investigator, and I've written one standalone called Missing Pieces. My last book was called The Blackbird, that came out in hardback last year, and the paperback comes out next week. And my new book, The Last Goodbye, comes out in June in hardback. So yeah, that's me. And I'm in my writing converted garage. So not quite as posh as a shed, but it's nice and warm at least. And if you hear noises, the recycling trucks going past this morning. So I apologize for that.
Tim, this shed really isn't posh. It's quite dusty and full of spiders.
Oh, it's quite nice to share your writing space.
Yeah, it does. It looks very exotic, I must say. All the plants at the window and stuff. It doesn't look like Essex. Looks like the rainforest or something like that.
She's trying to compete with Will Dean, you see. In forest.
And I believe, Tim, that The Blackbird, which is out next week, was a number 10 Sunday Times bestseller. Is that right?
It was, yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it got to 4, I think, which was amazing. So yeah, really pleased with that, and very, very grateful people are still buying my books after all this time.
Oh yes, and now I love both of your books. Tim, I think so it's possibly, was it the 13th you said, Raker book?
Blackbird is the 13th, yeah.
Amazing. I've written down the 10th. So I googled it, and Google told me you'd written 10 Raker books. So Google, I was wrong.
Google
so need to update
Google needs to catch up, yeah.
Yeah, and I really loved the layers to the story and the elements of a historical crime running in the background as well as a current crime. And I love the way they were woven together. Could you please start by telling our listeners about The Blackbird, please?
Yeah, so The Blackbird's about, all the Raker books are about a sort of mysterious and unexplained disappearance. And The Blackbird is about a couple who are driving home after seeing some friends. They're coming down a sort of country road, and CCTV footage shows them like 10 seconds before everything's perfectly fine, and then almost as soon as they pass the CCTV camera, they just career off the road into a 90-foot ravine. The car goes up in flames, but when the emergency services arrive, they find no bodies inside the car. So this couple have somehow disappeared from a burning car wreck. And sort of parallel to that is a storyline set so long ago since I wrote it, I can't even remember in the 80s or the 90s now, but a long time ago, where these 3 bodies are found on a beach in Northumberland, and as Raker looks into the case, obviously these 2 things kind of storylines come together. So yeah, like all the books, it starts with this mysterious disappearance, and from there, Raker goes down the rabbit hole like he normally does.
Fantastic. So gripping. I absolutely loved it. And Fiona, your book, I just finished reading it over the weekend. Absolutely loved it as well. It's so beautifully written and so twisty and intriguing. And I was saying to Leslie in the introduction that Soul Anguish, which is an amazing name, by the way, as a character was so interesting. I don't think I've ever read a more interesting detective in a series. So could you please tell your listeners what Into the Dark's about, please?
So I have come prepared with my paperback. There we go. For any viewers of the vodcast, not the podcast. So I actually, it sums it up perfectly on the back, if it's okay to read that. So one morning, Julianne arrives for her weekly run with best friend Piper Holden to discover an eerie scene at the Holdens' beautiful Art Deco seaside home. The radio is playing, the phones are charging on the worktop, the cars are in the garage. but the family is gone. And in 15-year-old Reva's bedroom, scrawled across the mirror in blood, are 3 words: make them stop. So that's kind of the jumping off point. And it introduces Saul Anguish, who is a young detective constable, his first time as part of the murder squad, or the murder club, as they call it, and his kind of associate called Dr. Clover March, who has very bright sort of pastely blue hair, and in his mind he calls her Blue, and there's an instant physical attraction between them, and so that's the kind of parallel storyline that runs alongside the missing persons story.
Oh, that's fantastic. No, it's a great start to a new series, Fiona. And I particularly loved the setting, you know, that coastal location. It felt so real. Plus those rather lavish homes that you portray so well. And I was wondering how much of the novel, that the setting rather, is based or inspired by your own coastal town, because I know you also live by the...
Yeah, I live near Leigh-on-Sea, which is a very kind of pretty seaside town on the Essex coast, and fairly affluent, but it was too small really for my purposes. I wanted a bigger place, and sort of more affluent, I think, even than Leigh is, and so that's why I created a town called Midtown-on-Sea. It's no coincidence it's called Midtown. It's a bit like your everyman. I wanted it to be a place that people could potentially sort of recognize that they might have visited themselves somewhere at some time, and I wanted to create this kind of affluent community. And as we all know, you know, affluent communities also have their dark underbelly as well. I'm endlessly fascinated by the idea, actually, that the darkest of crimes, our kind of worst fears, can still happen in very beautiful places.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. That's so true, isn't it? Yeah, and it makes that the juxtaposition of the horror and the niceness of the place.
Absolutely. And you know, we're all guilty of thinking, you know, it's the kind of whole sort of Insta lifestyle, isn't it, when you see people looking like they're doing exciting, interesting, amazing things, and they always look beautiful in their clothes, and they're wearing, you know, designer labels, and everything looks perfect on the surface, but it, you know, it's like an apple, isn't it, when it has a rotting inside.
Yeah, definitely. Why do you think it is, Fiona, that coastal locations are so often used in thrillers? What is it that makes them so fertile for that kind of fiction?
I don't know, but I think for me, the reason that, I mean, I love the seascape. I mean, I love the natural world anyway, and anyone who reads any of my books, there'll be some nod to the natural world in some way. But for me, the fascination is the ever-changing seascape. You know, you can wake up in the morning to patches of fog and the sound of the foghorn blaring. You know, it gives out this low groan, and it's so atmospheric. And then the fog can clear, and it can be the most beautiful, stunning vista, and the way that the light hits the water, and then, you know, the wind can pick up and the sky can change, and it just becomes a different place again. And it's the idea of having so much to play with, I think, with that as well. And you know, in kind of earlier books, most of my books have got some kind of coastal location. You know, you can have the sort of sinister fairground, or you know, things buried and hidden in the water, or the sand and seaweed and gulls and all of that stuff. It speaks to my soul.
Fantastic.
Oh, yes, I agree completely. And so, Tim, in a minute, we're going to be talking much more about writing a series. But I'd love to know where the idea for Blackbird came from, and how the idea formation works in an established series. So do you come up with the idea and then think about how Raker is slotted into it? Or is it more sort of twisted together with Raker more in the forefront when ideas are formed? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I would say probably because Raker's such an established character now, it doesn't take me really very long at the start of a book to kind of get into his headspace. In fact, it's really very easy because I know him so well. And the hardest thing, I think, with a long-term series character is trying to remember everything they've done and the things that have happened in their life. Because I mean, one thing I was very sure of from the start was that when I did a series, I mean, I never, to be honest, had expected it to last this long. So but you know, I was thinking that, you know, if I did 3 or 4 books, that all of those books would be interconnected in some way. So although you can read all of the books as standalone novels, you know, the events of one book should wash through to the next book. And, you know, these sort of life-changing events that happen to your character shouldn't be just forgotten, you know. So that's probably the hardest thing. The thing that requires most thought at the start of a book is, where are we at in terms of Raker and the character, and what has happened to him in the last book, and that kind of stuff. So to be honest, at this stage, it's really more about the thing that comes first really is more the idea for a disappearance, you know, a sort of mysterious and unexplained disappearance that you can hook audiences with. And so that's probably the trickiest thing now, because obviously I've done so many books that trying to come up with new ways to make people disappear in extraordinary ways is really quite hard, you know, because like, you know, Fiona talked about a family disappearing, you know, like I've done that before, you know, I did that in my 4th book, a family sort of vanish in the middle of dinner. I've done a guy disappearing on a tube train. I've done a whole village disappearing, you know, so it becomes quite hard to think about the ways in which you can make people disappear. So I would say that's probably the hardest thing and requires the most amount of work at the start of a book. And then once you have that, I mean, I don't plan my books, so once you have that, you just start writing and I kind of see where the idea takes you. And most of the time I'm not figuring out how these, you know, people disappeared until quite late on in the book. And that is both a good thing in a lot of ways, because, you know, some of your best ideas grow out organically, but it's also quite terrifying because you know, even quite late on in the book, you still don't really know how they disappeared. I mean, in No One Home, where the whole village disappeared, I really had no idea how I was going to pull that off until very late on in the book. So it's quite a scary thing, and probably that's the thing that comes first and occupies your headspace most of all, because I know Raker so well now.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it's so fascinating that both your books have got this sort of more than one missing person disappearing at the start. And like you said, Tim, obviously, if you're dealing with a missing persons investigator, it must be hard to come up with those ideas. And what about you, Fiona? When you had the idea, was it like a light bulb moment, or how did that sort of come about?
I don't know that it was a light bulb moment, but I think, you know, it's probably one of the reasons that, you know, readers love Tim's series so much is that, you know, we're all fascinated by the idea of somebody disappearing, and not just disappearing, I think not knowing. I think we can, you know, see that with the ongoing case involving Nicola Bulley at the moment. You know, it's having no idea what's happened to someone, which is kind of devastating, I think, to families and to friends and things. And so I think that becomes a compelling idea to explore, because you want to get to the bottom of what's happened, but there's so many different threads, so many different avenues of people's lives to explore. So it's kind of a rich seam to mine, I think. But I don't think I had a light bulb moment, but I think I maybe walked into my kitchen one day and there was a cereal bowl and there's milk flipped over the table, and I thought, you know, imagine if you walked into a room and the family had just completely gone and you had no idea where they were. So yeah, I think it kind of came from that. And, you know, lots of my books, I suppose, because of the nature of what we write, involve people who have gone missing in some capacity. And so it was just exploring that a bit further, I think. And I wanted, so Into the Dark, you know, the story then goes back to before their disappearance, and it's 5 days before they disappear, and then you can try, there's lots of clues there to try and work out what actually happened to them. So it was quite fun playing with structure as well.
Very complex structure. That's a great answer. The topic today is actually standalones to series. So we'll keep with you for a minute, Fiona, because this is your first series that you've written. What was it that made you want to write a series after writing 4 standalones? I
think, well, actually, so Rattle and the Collector are a duology. So they have the same detective in them and the story continues through. So they work together. And then The Neighbour and When I Was 10 are both standalones, but any eagle-eyed readers will know that, much as kind of Tim was saying about stories sort of washing through, there'll be a nod to a previous story, or if you're sort of paying close attention, you might see a character pop up that was in one of the earlier books. I quite like this idea of having a world that is kind of peopled by characters. So Into the Dark is definitely the first in a series, and I know some of my kind of bigger fans will have noticed that Saul Anguish also featured in the Collector, and you alluded earlier to his kind of dark past, Lauren. So he was in the Collector, he was a 15-year-old boy who is being groomed by a serial killer to continue his work, and then something happens in the Collector and he becomes a different person. And it was actually a Waterstones bookseller, Fiona Sharp, her name is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, who is a huge champion of crime fiction. And I was in her shop one day and she said, I love Saul so much. Imagine him as a detective. And she said that to me, and I went away and I could not get that thought out of my mind. And so I created Saul as an older man, kind of, 9 years on, very morally ambiguous. You don't know quite which way he's going to jump. And then I thought he would be a fascinating proposition as a detective. And so that's what I did. And I think in all honesty, I wasn't ready to start writing a series before, because I get bored very easily. I was worried that I would feel constricted and trapped by having to write about the same characters. But actually, one of the things that I seem to do in all my books almost sort of subconsciously is that I always have a story involving the victims. I have the sort of detective thread running through it, and then I have the kind of criminal or killer's thread running through it. And that's what keeps me interested, kind of thinking of a really interesting story to tell, a crime to investigate. And that's how I think you can sort of try and keep it fresh as well. But, there's also a little bit more to it too, because I love, as I said earlier, I love writing. I want to be able to do this for as long as I possibly can. And when I was looking around, and thinking about it and thinking about longevity, many of the writers that have managed to achieve that, tricky task of staying published are people that have series characters. And so I thought, okay, let's give that a try. Plus my publishers asked me to as well. So it's kind of a whole load of reasons, really.
Does Fiona Sharp know that she was the inspiration?
She does, yeah, she does.
Yeah, I spotted that in the acknowledgements.
Yeah.
Did you find the process of writing a book that you knew would be a series different from writing one of the earlier books? Knowing that you want it to go on and on, hopefully. Did that affect how you wrote it?
I suppose it did to an extent, because it's one of the reasons why I wanted my detective to be quite young, and so that if the series continues, he can, I don't want to run out of years, if that makes sense, while I'm kind of writing. So, he's he's almost 25 years younger than I am. So hopefully he's got a bit of life in him. And yeah, I was thinking about threads, I suppose, and how you need to continue this trajectory, this arc of the character. So, in part creating a nemesis, I suppose, and trying to build a team around him who readers would also become invested in, or in characters that the readers will be interested in seeing again. So yes, I did give that kind of careful thought, but I don't want to be kind of too constricted by that either. So and you will see in those who haven't read Into the Dark, and certainly my next book, which is the second in the series, things can get a bit hairy for him.
Ooh, yeah, exciting things.
Very interesting. Oh, I can't wait for the next one. So Tim, you talked a bit about the idea formation. When your series is so incredibly well established, how do you go about keeping it fresh? Do you have like a plan, or do you have like a spreadsheet for things you've done? And how does the ideas form? Do you go for a walk, or do you have post-its? How does the process work?
It just varies really. Like walking is a good way to come up with ideas. I used to be a big listen to a lot of podcasts when I walked, but actually you do some of your best thinking when you're just walking around. So I do a lot of that. But to be honest, I don't, like I said earlier, I don't plan. So a lot of this stuff I just keep in my head, as I'm going, and plot, finding out about the book is part of the journey, really, and I find that, and this isn't to say that people who plan their books are doing it wrong, because there's loads of different ways to write a book, and there's no correct way to do it. But for me, not planning allows me to experience the book the way the reader would experience it. So you're reacting to moments in the book how a reader would, and so that, especially in a thriller, I think is quite important, because in a thriller, you have to keep readers on their toes, you have to surprise them constantly, and I think if you're surprising yourself, then there's a good chance you'll be surprising the reader as well. Some of the very best, or I suppose the very best feedback I get is about moments in the series, almost always things that I haven't really thought about until I've got there, or it's a reaction to what's happening. For me, characters don't come alive until you get them on the page, so until they're interacting with one another, it's very difficult to get an idea of how a character is kind of going to behave in a certain circumstances. A good example of that is I have a major character in the Raker series called Colm Healy, who's like this burnt out ex-detective who's had a lot of trauma in his life, and I introduced him in the second book, The Dead Tracks, and he was really just going to be in there for one book, and him and Raker were just going to be kind of drawn together to solve this case, and then I was going to kill him off at the end of the Dead Tracks. But when I started writing him, I realized that I loved writing him, and that he was a much bigger and more complex character than I'd sort of thought about, I thought a lot about him when I was planning him, but, giving him a lot of thought. But until he was on the page, I didn't realize how big his story was and how complex he was as a character. And so that's a good example of the way that, I suppose if you plan to kill him off and then you didn't kill him off, then that's fine as well. But I think there's a good example of how not planning allows you to react, and I got halfway through the book and thought, there's no way I'm killing this guy off, and he's been a major part of the series now for, almost 14 books. So yeah, it's really just, ideas I don't think are the issue particularly, like ideas come to us all the time. I'm sure you guys are the same. You have lots of great ideas. It's actually more about which ideas to use, and which are the best ideas for this particular project that you're working on. How often do we start a book and then hit a wall on it after 20,000-30,000 words or whatever, and think that this idea sucks, this other idea I've had is so much better. Like, it literally happens. I'm sure it happens to you guys. It happens to me every book. When I hit what I call the wall after 25,000-30,000 words, I often think to me, is this the right idea? I've got loads of other ideas that are way better. So I don't think ideas are the problem. It's really just about which ideas work the best, and seeing how the characters exist within the idea that you've created.
That's so interesting. And the other thing about the established series that you've got is that The Blackbird was my first Raker book that I've read. But I didn't feel like I was playing catch up at all. And I also didn't feel like I was like going through loads of pages and learning all about all the other things he'd done, and like almost spoiling me wanting to go and read the other books. In fact, there was a mention of the one where the village disappears, a little mention of it, and I've now got that on my audio to listen to.
Oh,
because
right.
there was no spoilers, which I loved. And I just wondered how do you strike the balance of what to say in each book with that's going to satisfy the regular readers, but also be fine for the new readers as well? It blows my mind.
Well, I think, you just have to be wary of the fact that, anyone can join at any point. So you can't have, 2 or 3 pages of explanation about Raker's history. I think if your character is well written enough, then readers can get an almost immediate idea of who this person is. You don't need to give them the entire backstory, so hopefully Raker is well written enough that people can get a fairly good idea of who he is, and morally where he is, and how he feels about things and why he's so driven quite early on. And I think then you just dot around little breadcrumbs for people to kind of fill in the gaps, you know, and I think you've got to be careful. It's very easy, you know, when you've been established for a long time to you know, relitigate a lot of stuff that isn't really that relevant, you know, like what he was getting up to 5, 6, 7 books ago is only really relevant if it needs to be relevant. You know, if there is a character that returns in the new book that you know you last saw in book 6, then yes, you're going to have to fill in a little bit of backstory there, but otherwise I try not to get too bogged down in that stuff. I think it's just important that readers get an idea of why Raker does what he does, because he goes to some extraordinary lengths to solve these cases, because if he didn't, it wouldn't be a very good book, you know. So
Yeah.
so you know, he does these things, and I think it's important to give readers an idea of what has happened to him in order, you know, to make him this as driven as he is, you know. But that stuff really needs to be used with a light touch, because otherwise, you know, you lose readers who haven't been with you the whole time, and even lose readers who have been with you a long time. You know, readers who've been with you a long time, they don't want to hear about retrudging through all the books they've already read, you know. So it's just a balance, I think. And, you know, obviously, you know, writing is a huge learning curve. You're still learning about, you know, learning your art. You know, you never learn it completely, but you're still learning your art, even all these books in. Every book teaches me something else that I didn't know before. So I think as you go on, you just get better at that sort of stuff, you know. So it's really just a case of making sure that the balance is right. And I think that's more like a personal judgment, you know, and obviously your editor can help you get that sort, or agent or whatever can help you get that perspective on it. But yeah, it's really just a sense of getting the balance right between bringing new readers up to speed and also rewarding long-term readers with, you know, stuff like I was talking about earlier, stuff that washes through. You need to address that too. So it's a tricky balance, but I think the most important thing is that you don't alienate new readers, you know.
Definitely. Lauren and I were supposed to be talking earlier in our introduction about how important character was in a series, but we didn't get round to it, did we, Lauren? Because we got distracted. We were talking about eyes and book launches and all sorts of other things. But, you know, character is so important, isn't it, in a series? I mean, you've just been talking about David Raker, Tim, you know, who's a fascinating man, a missing persons investigator. He doesn't play by the rules, but he's a good guy, isn't he, at heart? And Fiona, DS Saul Anguish, which again, fabulous name, I mean, brilliant, is equally fascinating with such a past. And so I was wondering from both of you, what are the key characteristics, do you think, of a main character in a series? Fiona, what do you think about that one?
I don't know that there's a, you know, paint by numbers rules for it really, but I think for me, it's about trying to create a character that's memorable, because whenever you think about any long-running series, readers don't so much remember the plot as remember the character. You know, and I've said this before, but, you know, if someone says, I don't know, Oxford, classic cars, classical music, without even saying a name, you know immediately that I'm talking about Morse, for example. And that's what you want, I think. So carving out a niche for your character and making it so that readers care about them, and that whether or not they are, you know, because Saul is a morally ambiguous character. He does, you know, terrible things, but actually for good reasons. And, you know, it's astonishing to me the number of readers that have said to me, I know that, you know, Saul he's not great, is he? But is it wrong that I'm a little bit in love with him? And so it's about trying to create characters that appeal to readers too, I think. So I don't so much go through, but I think the thing about a past, or, you know, my agent always says it, and for, you know, listeners to this podcast who are also kind of emerging writers, it's the single most useful piece of information really that kind of I always ask myself is, why is a character doing what they do? And once you kind of nail down that bit, once you nail down why your detective behaves in this way, what drives him to do this, why does he or she do this, then you start to grow a backstory and you start to make them interesting. And I think that's the key thing, that there's got to be enough to them to make you want to keep on returning to them too, and for readers to keep returning to them as well.
Yeah. And anything you want to add to that, Tim?
No, I mean, I think that's pretty spot on. I mean, I think that what Fiona says about how, you know, series characters are not, you don't remember the individual books. I mean, I can't even remember half of what I've written, and I wrote the books, you know. So I think it's just like, it's important that, you know, the character is front and center. I think you also, what Fiona said was as true, as you have to give them a reason. You have to show what drives them, you know, even if they're doing bad things, you have to kind of show what is behind that decision. You know, I don't think Raker is particularly, I definitely wouldn't describe him as a bad guy, you know, like he does some dodgy things, but he does it because he's so completely driven, you know. And obviously when you read back to the start of the book, the reason he's so driven is because he's basically at the start of the books, he's trying to fill a gap left behind by the death of his wife, you know, who died from breast cancer. So, you know, tragically taken from him, and these missing people are a way for him to, you know, fill that gap, feel emotionally and physically fill it, you know. So that's what drives him. And then, you know, he gets a taste for it, and as the series goes on, he realizes that, you know, missing people are kind of his oxygen, really. So it's what gets him up in the morning. So it's you know, it's important, I think, to give them a driver.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I think you just need to, you know, they don't have to, you know, one of the fallacies I think with series characters is believing that they have to be, you know, like, okay, this my series character is going to be different because he listens to, you know, this crazy music, or, you know, he really loves this, you know, like he loves going to Weston-super-Mare Pier every week, or whatever it is, you know, like something just random, like to try and give some artificial way to build in him as being, you know, different, or her being different. But you don't need that. Like, so much of building a character is just in who that person is and how they interact with other people. You get a very, you know, I never really at any point in the series have I described Raker physically, but you get a pretty clear idea of who he is just by the way he interacts with people and treats people, you know.
Yeah, and that's sort of what you were saying earlier, kind of brings me on to the follow-up, which was, I was going to say, we have a lot of would-be writers and writers, you know, listening to this program, this podcast, and I was just wondering if you have any advice about what not to avoid. I mean, both of you really, what should you avoid when you're writing a series? Any particular tropes or things? What do you think, Fiona?
I don't know that you should necessarily avoid anything, but I think that you should think really carefully, if you are thinking about a series, about how to make your central characters compelling. I mean, and relatable. I think that's the thing I have been thinking about a lot more, is sort of universality and relatability, you know, so people can see something of themselves in your characters that you create, or something that they would never be, either or. And I think that kind of sort of fascinates me endlessly. And I think as I've become a more experienced writer, I realized that ultimately character is what it's all about, you know, much more than plot. And that's not to say that high concept, brilliant plots don't work, because they can and do, but it's about making sure that your characters are so much more than just this 2D facsimile. You know, you really want to get under the skin of your character, I suppose. And, you know, as Tim said, it's, you know, from sort of Tim's descriptions, it's about, you know, you showing who your character is through their interactions, rather than kind of just telling the reader too, I think.
Yeah, good point. Yeah,
I mean, that would be my biggest piece of advice, is you don't need to say, he stood in front of a mirror and saw that he was 6'1" and had black hair. You know, like, that is completely irrelevant, you know, like how they it's not irrelevant, but it's just the least interesting thing about your character is how they look, unless that, you know, how they look has some direct impact on how they are with people. You know, much more important is their worldview and why that worldview exists and why they do what they do and what their motivation is for keeping on doing what they're doing. You know, like, what is Breaker's motivation for going for 14 books now? You know, his motivation at the start was filling this gap in his world, you know, because he lost the person that he loved, you know. But what is it now, at this point in the series? You know, it has to develop. You know, you can't still have him 14 years on, you know, because of the death of his wife, you know, as tragic as that death was, you know. So they have to develop over time, but I think you just have to make their worldview obvious to the reader, and also I think it has to be a worldview that isn't completely repugnant to the reader. You know, like, we don't mind our characters being, you know, morally grey at all, you know, but whatever they do, there has to be a reason for it and a justification for it, and ultimately the reader has to get behind the character. You know, you don't have to love all your characters in the book as a reader, but I think if you're going to have a series character, I reckon it would be pretty hard to sustain a series where the main character consistently does stuff that you find very uncomfortable or morally objectionable. You know, that's really hard to do. I mean, I really hold my hat up to anyone who can do that, because I think that's very hard. You know, basically your character has to be doing things that, whether they get there via morally grey ways, is ultimately the sort of right thing, I think. And all that you kind of figure out as you get more experienced, I think, but definitely off the bat. And I think another thing to avoid is just trying, you know, doing things that have been done very well by other long-standing writers. So I mean, like, having a detective who's an alcoholic or addicted to drugs or addicted to sex or, you know, addicted to gambling or whatever it is, or loves jazz music or loves classical music and all that sort of stuff. You've got to be very, very careful of that sort of stuff, you know, but you don't have to give them a you know, an emotional like weight like that. You know, like Breaker's emotional weight is that his wife died of a disease that, you know, unfortunately lots and lots and lots of us will die of in our lifetime. And I purposely did that because I wanted people to be able to immediately identify with this guy, the loss that he'd experienced, because cancer is something that affects everyone, you know, whether you're affected by it directly or indirectly, you know. So that was purposeful, and I didn't want to give him an alcohol problem or a drug problem. I wanted this to be like front and center, and I wanted people to look at this guy and think, actually, you know, I can see something of myself in him.
I mean, with my detective, I'm not sure that there are many detectives who have been groomed to be serial killers, but for the same reason, I wanted something that made him stand out, and might explain why he behaves in the way that he does, because he's also, you know, has an incredibly traumatic upbringing. His mother was an alcoholic. He was neglected as a young boy, and his father was violent. And so because of those reasons, you know, we all know that, you know, our past influence who we are. And I think that's kind of an interesting concept. And one of the things I would advise, one of my lovely friends sent me this notebook, and I don't know if you can see it, but it says Fiona Cummins Saul and Blue character notes, it says on the front.
Oh, it's amazing.
That's
so
lovely.
that I can keep track of my characters, because that's one of the things I know. Tim's a lot more experienced in writing a series, but, you know, even down to writing the dates where the previous book happened, you know, and the birthday of your character and how old they are, little things that you might not immediately be able to kind of, you know, you don't want to have to be going back through your old manuscript to try and find it. So you know what colour eyes they might have, or you know what they don't like to eat, or all of that kind of stuff, so you have it to hand. So that's what I'm started doing, creating a little bit of a Bible, I suppose.
Oh, that's so good. So you guys have already raced ahead now and answered my question about advice, which is brilliant. And I was going to ask about whether you keep like a Bible. What about you, Tim? How do you keep track of birthdays and middle names and aunts and things?
I just never mention them, so you don't have to remember them.
I knew you were going to say that, because you're not a planner.
No, I don't really like. I couldn't even tell you when Raker's birthday was. I purposely don't do that because it's just after a long time, you're just like, it's a nightmare. So,
okay, maybe I should take that advice then and avoid anything that's.
It's very hard, and once you've done a lot of books, like you've introduced a lot of characters, and it's very, very hard to keep track of them all. Secondary characters, this is obviously, and it just because that those tiny minor details, unless they're relevant to the story, I tend not to worry about it too much, because I think it's just the reader doesn't really get particularly hung up on that. I mean, you will get readers definitely emailing you if you get the birthday in one book different to the birthday in another book, and that's exactly why I don't do it, but I don't think readers generally care that much about that stuff. It's more about the bigger picture stuff, so I don't tend to. What's great is that I keep the major events usefully in my head. So if I get like knocked over tomorrow, then there's a problem, But my copy editor also, my long-term copy editor is amazing. She has like a big Raker Bible. So she'll often say, actually, they disappeared at dinner like 10 years ago, not 8 years ago, or he got on the train 11 years ago, or whatever it is, So it's just like, that's useful just to have that. But I don't tend to go too deep into those sort of very, very specific details, because I think after a while it just becomes an absolute nightmare to keep track of it all.
Well, that's so interesting, because I have trouble keeping track of like my character's age from like the start of the book to the end of the book, and I do just keep track now in a separate spreadsheet myself of like certain key details about them. But I can totally agree, and I thought that's what you were going to say, but it's so interesting, Tim, that you've actually gone the other way, like actually vague is better in a series. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. I mean, like Fiona's obviously only on the second book of a series, so I think it's fine now. I was probably doing the same at that point, but I think once you get a few books down the line, you're like, no, this is too much like hard work. I'm not.
Well, especially if you've got a good copy editor.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's more for ease of reference. So, for example, I mentioned there's a church, for example, and I might jot down the name of the church, that's Midtown's Church, so that I don't have to go hunting for it. Or the medication that one of my characters takes, I would jot down the name of that. So it's just so you don't have to keep looking for it, I suppose. Just a series of notes, really, but maybe I'll get bored with it. I mean, I'm like Tim, I don't plan at all. So we both keep things in our head. So this is the nearest I've come to writing things down and having a little book. So we'll see.
Well, I suppose now you've got that beautiful book, you've got to use it.
You've got to write it.
Now, Into the Dark was, as we said in the beginning, was published last week in paperback. And Tim, your paperback of The Blackbird is out next week. So what's next for both of you? Is it the next in the series, or is it another book? Who's going to go first with that one?
Go on, Tim.
Okay, well, the next one is called, the next Raker book is called The Last Goodbye. That comes out on June the 8th, I think. And I've just done the copy edits for that. Absolute nightmare to write. Probably the worst writing experience of my entire life, that book. So I'm glad that it's done. It was just so hard. Like, for people who've read The Blackbird, that certain things are set up at the end of the book that I had to carry through to this one. And although the response to the ending of The Blackbird has been amazing, I think in retrospect, I did make it very difficult for myself with this book. Like, I carried over at least two things and also a third thing. And it was just a nightmare juggling it all. And, because when you carry stuff, I mean, a lot of the books don't do this. I've only done it with twice. I did it with Vanished, was my third book, carried over into Never Coming Back, which was my fourth book with its ending. And The Blackbird sort of carries over into The Last Goodbye with its ending. And I remembered now why I don't do it. It's because it's just a nightmare, because you have to, with the new book, you have to deliver on what you set up.
Yeah.
So you have to deliver for readers a really satisfying conclusion to the cliffhanger, basically. And then you also have to introduce a new element, a new disappearance, something that's really hooky and exciting, and juggling all those together is just a nightmare. So there were actually stages in this book where I genuinely thought, I'm not going to be able to I don't know how to finish this book. I don't know how to, so that's another thing that anyone who wants to write books should know, that writing definitely does not get easier as the more you do it. If anything, it gets harder. So, it was just such a hard book. But I think, having read the copy edits, I think it's just about come together okay in the end. So, people will be able to get their hands on that on June the 8th.
I'm sure it has come together, and we can't wait to read it. But although I'm sorry that you struggled with the writing of it, it's very reassuring for, because, you've written so many novels. It's quite reassuring for those of us who've only written 4 to know that, this is a fact, this happens. And the longer you do it, it doesn't necessarily get any easier.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And I think in a way, like writing books, it shouldn't be easy though, should it? I mean, no. It should, I'd be deeply suspicious of anyone who came in and said, "Oh, I've just written a book and it was just so easy," or at the end of the book was like, "This is just so good, honestly. My book."
Well, I think it's fair to say that
like don't trust anyone who thinks that, because at the end of your book, you should absolutely hate it, and you should have really struggled to get it done. Because the books that have been the hardest to write are almost always hard to write for a reason, and that's because you're attempting something really ambitious or interesting or different. True. And if you can pull it off, then it really will be brilliant. So yeah.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because I do think some books are easier to write than others as well, in the same way that some ideas come to you fully formed, like when I was 10, which was quite a big book for me. It was so it just kind of wrote itself, and I don't know whether and I hate it when people say that, because it's really annoying when you're struggling with a book. And I've had books that are really difficult to write and books that are easier, and I don't know, somebody, I think it was William Shaw, said this to me, that actually that happens, but readers can't tell the difference between the books, the ones that you've agonized over, and then the ones that have kind of just sort of slipped out. They just all read the same way. So I don't know. But
so what's next for you, Fiona? What's next?
So my next book is the second in this series, and it's out on July the 20th, and it's called All of Us Are Broken, and it tells the story of a lone parent who goes on a trip to Scotland with her 2 young children, and they stumble across a young, very violent couple who are hell-bent on infamy, forcing the mum into making an impossible choice. Ooh. It's dark, but it's also about love too.
Wow, that sounds very exciting. And we always finish off by asking our guests what they're currently reading or what they've recently read and would like to recommend to our listeners or viewers. So what about you, Tim? What are you reading at the moment or have just read?
Well, I'm reading a book called The Ugly Truth at the moment. I can't actually find where I put it, but I am honestly reading it, Lauren. It's somewhere, but anyway, so I promised you I read it, and I've got.
No, don't worry. I never expect anyone to read it.
But, it's really good. I've read that. It's brilliant, isn't it?
It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I've just so I've just started that because I just finished The Drift by CJ Tudor, because I'm doing an event with her next week, so I wanted to read that. And then what did I read just before that? I got an early copy of Don't Look Back by Joe Spain, which was excellent.
Oh, you're so lucky.
Oh, yeah.
And just tell us quickly about your event. So that's with CJ Tudor next week. Whereabouts is that?
That's up in Nottingham, in her hometown. So I hope I don't get booed off stage as being the.
I'm sure you won't.
No,
she's having a whale of a time in the States and Canada.
I know, yeah. Lucky old her. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And Fiona, what have you been reading recently?
I've just finished one called No One Saw a Thing. I think it's called that, by Andrea Mara. And,
yes, I got that.
Oh, it's so good because it plays into all of your fears. Essentially, it's about a mum who's struggling on the underground, and her 2 children go on the tube ahead of her. The doors close and the train disappears. And then when they get to the next stop, only one of the children gets off.
Yeah, I've got it. I'm a little bit scared to read it.
I'm currently reading A Square of Sevens by Laura Shepherd Robinson. And I've got a huge pile to read of books. So it's just, I've got The Last Passenger by Will Dean. I've got The Assistant by Amanda Reynolds. I've got heaps of stuff. I can't even think. So it's quite hard to kind of choose what to read next. That's one of the things that the sort of you don't know, is that you get all of these proofs that come in and you feel so guilty when you don't get to read them.
What about you, Lauren?
So I haven't done a lot of reading because I've been super busy, but I did read over the weekend Into the Dark by Fiona Cummins, which is out now and absolutely fantastic. Just one of those books that you just want to keep getting back to. So I always think that's such a great book. When you I don't often read during the day, actually. I'm much more of a evening reader. But yeah, if I'm sort of drawn to a book during the day, then I know I'm hooked. And then I read a book called Don't Swipe Right by L.M. Kilton, which is the first book I have read that merges humour and thriller. And then I've just been sent another one which does the same thing, which is called You'd Look Better as a Ghost by Joanna Wallace. And again, I think that's humour and thriller. So I think it's obviously a trend that's happening this year. So I thought Don't Swipe Right was so funny. And so I'm really looking forward to the next one. I'm not sure if I'm completely sold on the merge of the genres yet, but I'm intrigued to see where it goes, I think. What about you, Leslie?
Well, I haven't been reading much at all because I'm doing my edits and it's quite difficult for me to read at the moment. But I have read Diane Jeffrey's latest book. Well, it's not due out yet. I'm reading a very early advanced reader copy. And I won't say the title because I know the title is going to change. But I haven't read any of Diane Jeffrey's psychological thrillers before. And she's a really good writer. And I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it, so I'd recommend her to all our listeners, and hopefully I'll be back in the reading groove once my other eye's done.
Yes. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for in today's episode. So thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Tim, for giving us so much great insight into writing a series. It's certainly given me food for thought, and I've just been scribbling down a few little notes about some of the things you've said. I'm not planning to write a series, but I think there's a couple of things you said about what drives your main character, which I think I need to think about when my structured edits come back next week. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both. It's been brilliant having you on. We've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been fantastic. And in our next episode, Nikki Smith and Lauren will be chatting to debut author Meera Shah with the topic, should I dump my day job now that I've got a book deal? So that should be interesting. I can't wait to listen to that one. And before that, so next week, we've got our third social media minisode all about how to sell books on social media with the wonderful Zoe Lee.
Absolutely. And which leaves me with the final task of saying goodbye from Tim.
Goodbye. Thank you for having me.
Goodbye from Fiona.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from us. Goodbye.
Bye.